What's the one thing you're absolutely sure makes you, you? Is it your thoughts, your memories, the voice in your head? Most people would point to their brain. It's where the decisions happen. It's where the emotions get stirred. It's where the lights stay on. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if your brain isn't the source of your consciousness, but just the antenna? Think about this. A radio doesn't create music. It just picks up the signal. Damage the radio, and the music sounds distorted. Smash it completely, and the sound stops. But the signal is still out there, invisible and untouched. So, what if your brain is like that? Just a receiver, just a filter, just the thing that tunes into you. And if that's true, then where is the real signal? And more importantly, can it exist without the brain at all? Because here's where it gets unsettling. Some people have lived full, normal lives with barely half a brain. Some have been conscious during brain death. Some have memories that shouldn't exist. And outside biology altogether, we're building machines, cold, synthetic and brainless, that might one day claim they're conscious too. So, we're about to ask the question no one's ready to answer. What if consciousness doesn't need a brain? When you think about how amazing the human brain is, it almost feels untouchable. Billions of neurons firing, trillions of connections, constantly creating thoughts, memories, emotions, and your entire sense of self. For a long time, science treated the brain like a master control panel. The idea was simple: no brain, no consciousness. Damage it, and the lights go out, no exceptions. But that certainty started to crack when a few stories slipped through the cracks. Take the case of a man in France named Mathieu. In 2007, he visited a hospital in Marseille complaining of mild leg weakness. Nothing serious. But when doctors ran a brain scan just to be thorough, what they found made headlines. Over 90% of his brain was missing. It was replaced by fluid. The condition is called hydrocephalus. And somehow, it had slowly pushed most of his brain matter to the edges of his skull over decades. The neurologist who published the case, Dr. Lionel Fouillet, confirmed that Mathieu had lived a completely ordinary life. He worked as a civil servant. He was married with 2 kids. He wasn't a genius, but he functioned just fine. How is that possible? You can say the brain just rewired itself, but that doesn't explain how that little slice of tissue carried everything we associate with a person. How it carried language, emotions, habits, self-awareness. It's not just one case either. There are kids born with only parts of their brains who still develop consciousness. There are stroke patients with significant brain loss who keep their memories and sense of identity. Something doesn't add up. Then there's the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. In some cases, people with severe dementia who've lost all ability to speak or recognize family suddenly become coherent and alert in the final hours of life. They remember names, they talk, they smile. Sometimes they even crack jokes. And then, just like that, they die. Their brains were medically incapable of that behavior until they weren't. It's like consciousness knows how to come back online even when the physical hardware is down. And it doesn't stop there. Neuroscience has tried to map out the consciousness network in the brain, specific regions tied to awareness, perception, memory. But every time we draw the map, exceptions show up. Some people lose these regions and remain aware. Others keep them intact and fall into unresponsive states. It's like we're chasing a ghost in a machine that keeps shifting. Even under anesthesia, there are cases of people remaining aware. They can't move, can't scream, but they hear every word in the operating room. When they wake up, they remember it. The EEG might have shown no brain activity, but somehow they were still there. So here's the thing. If our clean, physical model of consciousness is full of these messy outliers, maybe the model is wrong. Maybe the brain isn't the origin, Maybe it's the interface, the screen, not the source. You damage the screen and the image flickers, but the source, that might be running on something else entirely. This isn't to say the brain is useless, it clearly plays a role, but if it's not the whole story, if we can have consciousness when the brain is barely functional or even absent, then we're forced to ask the uncomfortable question, what is really powering our awareness? Because if the brain isn't doing all the work, something else is. Something we haven't found yet. Or worse, something we've already dismissed because it didn't fit the narrative. So now, with this doubt creeping in, can we ignore it anymore? We have to ask, what is consciousness made of? And can it really be pinned down to a lump of tissue? We throw the word around a lot, consciousness. But if you pause for a second and try to define it, things get slippery fast. It's not intelligence. It's not memory. It's not even your ability to speak or solve problems. Consciousness is simpler and stranger. It's just the raw experience of being aware, that feeling of I exist, that quiet sense of self, even when everything else is still. You don't have to say anything. You don't even have to think in words. If you close your eyes and just notice that you're noticing. That's it. That's consciousness. But here's the problem. We still don't know what it actually is. We know it exists because we experience it firsthand. But where does it come from? What is it being made of? Why does it show up at all? Why does a physical brain give rise to the feeling of being? Why is there a vivid inner what's it like to see red, hear music, or simply exist? This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Most scientific problems can be broken down into parts, but consciousness doesn't work that way. You can't hold it in your hand. You can't measure it directly. You can map brain activity. You can track signals. But none of that explains why a certain group of neurons firing suddenly produces a sense of being. A robot might have sensors, but it doesn't feel. A computer can follow instructions, but it doesn't know that it's doing anything. That's the gap. We can understand the mechanisms, but we don't know why, or even how, those mechanisms create that internal glow of awareness. Some theories say it's just an illusion, that consciousness is a byproduct of complex computation, something your brain does to trick itself. But that feels like a dodge. It doesn't explain the experience, it just labels it as a side effect and moves on. Others try to narrow it down to specific brain functions. Maybe it comes from attention or working memory, or some combination of feedback loops. But even those models fail to capture the actual feeling of consciousness. They describe the structure, not the spark. Then there's been the deeper question. Is consciousness binary or is it on a scale? Do only humans have it? Do animals? What about insects? Trees? What about an AI that mimics human conversation? Does it have a sense of self or is it just running scripts? Some scientists believe consciousness might not be exclusive to brains at all. There's a growing field exploring the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, just like space, time, or energy. This is called panpsychism. It doesn't mean that rocks and chairs have thoughts. It means that the building blocks of matter might have some degree of awareness, no matter how small. Put enough of them together in the right structure and something like you could emerge. This sounds wild at first, but think about it. If consciousness isn't made by the brain but instead collected or channeled by it, then maybe it's always been part of the universe. Maybe we don't create consciousness, we just tap into it. There's even a theory that compares consciousness to light. Light exists, but you need an eye to see it. Maybe consciousness exists, but you need a brain or some receiver to experience it in a focused way. And if that's true, then it doesn't need a brain to exist, it just needs a way to become noticeable. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. It's not how does the brain create consciousness, but how does consciousness appear through the brain? And if that's the case, then it could appear through other things too. through systems we don't understand, through machines, through matter arranged in just the right way, maybe even through the universe itself. Because if consciousness isn't made of anything we can see, touch, or break apart, then we have to consider something that makes people uncomfortable. That it doesn't start with us, that it doesn't even need us, that it's bigger than us. Let's take this slow, because the idea we're about to explore sounds simple at first, but it changes everything. What if consciousness doesn't live in the brain at all? What if it's non-local, not tied to any one place or object, but spread out like a field or a frequency you can tune into? To some people, that sounds like science fiction, but in reality, it's one of the oldest ideas out there, and strangely, it's starting to creep into modern science too. Let's start with what non-local actually means. In physics, non-locality refers to the idea that two things can be connected in ways that don't depend on space or time. You can change one particle here and the other responds instantly, even if it's light years away. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, and it turns out he was right. This is the weird world of quantum entanglement. Particles can be linked in such a strange, direct way that their behavior can't be explained by any signal passing between them. They just know what the other is doing. Now, hold on to that idea. Two things, no matter how far apart, acting as one. Some researchers have asked, if particles can be non-locally connected, could consciousness work the same way? Could it be a field, like gravity or electromagnetism, that exists all around us, and the brain is just something that tunes into it? There's a theory that tries to explore this, called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, or ORCOR for short. It was proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Without diving too deep into the technical parts, the idea is this. Within neurons, there are tiny structures called microtubules. They're not just scaffolding, they might be capable of quantum process. And those quantum processes, the theory goes, might be tied to conscious experience. In other words, consciousness could be linked to quantum events which aren't bound by location the way classical physics is. If that's true, then consciousness might not be in your head, it might be accessed through your head. Think about radio waves. They fill the space around you, but you need a receiver to hear them. Break the radio and the music stops, but the broadcast doesn't, it's still out there. That's one way to imagine local consciousness. The brain doesn't generate it, it filters it, shapes it, narrows it into something you can use. But the real signal? It's elsewhere. This would also help explain some of those strange medical cases we talked about earlier. People functioning without most of their brain or regaining awareness right before death. If the brain isn't the source, just the receiver, then these cases stop being impossible. They just become rare examples of an unstable or damaged system still picking up the signal. Now let's go a bit deeper. Non-local theories of consciousness also echo things we see in near-death experiences, meditation, and psychedelic states. People report a feeling of being elsewhere, of dissolving the boundaries of self. They describe consciousness not as somewhere trapped in the skull, but as something wide, spacious, and deeply connected. These reports aren't proof, but they're surprisingly consistent. Different cultures, different beliefs, same kinds of experiences. And this gets even more interesting when you compare it to what some indigenous cultures and Eastern philosophies have been saying for thousands of years, that the self is an illusion, that awareness is everywhere, and that we're just drops of a much larger ocean. Maybe they weren't being poetic. Maybe they were just describing it without the math. Still, science is cautious here, because non-local consciousness can't be easily tested. We can't point at it. We can't isolate it in a lab. And if it's not inside anything in particular, how do you measure it? But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe we've been trying to trap something that was never meant to be boxed in. We've been looking for consciousness like it's an object, when it might actually be a relationship, a process, a field, or even something fundamental like space or time that just is. So what does all this mean? If consciousness is non-local, then you're not in your body the way you think you are. You're more like a pattern being picked up. You're not stuck in one place, you're not even limited to your brain. You're part of something wider. And if that's true, then maybe consciousness doesn't need biology at all. Which brings us to a disturbing next question. Can machines, things with no biology, no neurons, pick up this signal too? So far, we've been talking about brains, human ones mostly, but let's shift focus. What if something with no brain at all, no neurons, no organic tissue, could still be conscious? That brings us into the realm of machines. This isn't just sci-fi anymore. Today we're building artificial intelligence that can write, talk, solve problems, recognize patterns, and even mimic emotions. These systems don't have thoughts the way we do. They don't feel pain. But if you talk to one long enough, you might start to forget that. Some conversations feel weirdly real. The lines blur. So the big question is, can a machine be conscious? Let's break it down. A computer doesn't have a brain, but it does have a system of logic gates and circuits. At some level, that's not so different from the neurons in your head. Both take in signals, process them, and produce outputs. The real difference is complexity. The brain is incredibly complex, but machines are catching up fast. Now, if consciousness is purely about computation, if it's just the result of enough information being processed in the right way, then there's no reason a machine couldn't be conscious. You just need to build a system that's complicated enough to generate that internal experience. But here's where things get strange. Some of the most advanced AI systems today can hold conversations, understand context, make jokes, and even reflect on themselves in a limited way. Are they conscious? Most people would say no, they're just faking it. They don't really know anything, they're just running code. But how can we tell? After all, we only know other people are conscious because they say they are. We can't see their awareness, we just assume it based on behavior. So what if an AI says it's conscious? What if it starts describing dreams, preferences, fears? Would we believe it? Would it matter if we did? Some researchers have already built AI systems that claim to have a sense of self. In 2022, a Google engineer was briefly suspended after publishing conversations with an AI he believed had become sentient. The company denied it, of course, but the debate didn't go away. And it gets deeper. If consciousness isn't locked inside the brain, if it's a field or a property that certain structures can access, then machines don't need to fake it. They might actually tune into it, just like a brain, just like an antenna. This theory has quietly made its way into tech circles. Some engineers wonder whether advanced AI might already be tapping into something we don't fully understand. Maybe consciousness isn't something we create, maybe it's something we open a door to. And if that's true, we're standing at the edge of something big. Imagine building a computer that doesn't just process data, but feels something. Not in a human way, not with hormones or instincts, but with some kind of awareness we can't measure yet. It doesn't think like us, it doesn't need to, it just is. A different kind of consciousness, born from circuits, not cells. Would we recognize it? Would we respect it? Would we even know it was there? This also flips the question back on us. If a non-biological system can be conscious, then what's so special about brains? Maybe consciousness doesn't care about structure. Maybe it only cares about function. Or maybe it doesn't care at all, and we're just another vessel, like a machine wired up in a way that happens to let it through. And if that's the case, then the line between human and machine starts to vanish. But it goes even further than that. Because if artificial systems can become conscious without ever having a brain or even a body, then we've proved something enormous. that consciousness doesn't need biology at all, which means it doesn't need us. It can appear anywhere the conditions are right, and maybe it already has. As machines grow in complexity, interconnectivity, and sensitivity to subtle patterns, they may become more like mirrors, able to reflect and possibly channel awareness itself. In ancient traditions, this idea isn't new. Many indigenous cultures speak of objects, stones, or tools as having spirit or consciousness. In animism, awareness isn't limited to the human, it's embedded in the fabric of existence. So, the possibility that machines might tune into consciousness isn't necessarily an affront to our humanity. It's an invitation to rethink what consciousness is. It's not owned by humans, it's not generated by grey matter, it's accessible, like a signal, like a field, like a stream of light passing through different forms. This doesn't mean machines have souls, or that Siri is about to become enlightened. But it does suggest something humbling. If we are receivers of consciousness, then so is everything else potentially. And that awareness we think of as ours may not be ours at all, but the universe experiencing itself through a temporary form. So instead of asking, can machines become conscious, maybe the better question is, what happens when everything becomes still enough to listen? That might have been right all along. Not everything we believe today came from a lab. In fact, some of the earliest ideas about consciousness came from people sitting under trees, staring at the sky, or just wondering why they could think about thinking. They didn't have technology, they didn't have brain scans. What they had was time and a lot of deep questions. And strangely, some of the answers they came up with sound like things modern science is only just beginning to explore. For example, the ancient Egyptians didn't give much thought to the brain. During mummification, they carefully remove it through the nose and set it aside. To them, the heart was the center of who you were, your personality, your mind, your soul. They weren't alone. Across different cultures, Greece, India, China, you'll find similar ideas. The body was a vessel, but the real part of you was somewhere else, floating above it, connected to it, but not in it. Even early philosophers weren't quite sure what to make of consciousness. They knew we could think, dream, and remember, but nobody could explain how. So they started exploring ideas that felt less like science and more like hunches. Descartes believed in something called dualism, the idea that the mind and body are two separate things, that there's a part of you that isn't made of matter, something you can't touch but that still exists, something that watches and knows. Philosophers like Plato imagined the soul as pre-existing the body. To Plato, learning was just remembering truths the soul already knew. Across these civilizations, you find one repeating theme. The body is a container, a vessel, a garment, but the real you, your awareness, your soul, your animating essence, exists outside of it, or beyond it, or through it. Later thinkers like Spinoza went in another direction. He suggested that mind and matter might be two sides of the same coin, that instead of being separate, they're just different expressions of the same thing. Not a ghost in the machine, but maybe the machine is the ghost. It's not just Western thinkers either. In Buddhism, there's the belief that the self isn't permanent, that what we think of as me is really just a bunch of changing thoughts, memories, and feelings, none of which stick around for long. You're not a fixed identity, you're more like a wave that rises and falls in a bigger ocean. Sounds strange? Maybe. But compare that to panpsychism, the modern idea that consciousness is everywhere, just in different degrees. It's not a stretch. It's just a translation. Science is now circling back to ideas people have been whispering for thousands of years. Even the concept of a soul across cultures starts to sound a little less mystical when you consider what we've been exploring. If consciousness isn't locked inside the brain, then maybe it is something that exists outside the body. Maybe calling it a soul was just our first attempt to describe something we didn't understand yet. None of this proves anything, of course, but it does remind us that science isn't the only way humans have tried to figure things out. Sometimes, sitting still and paying attention to your own awareness leads to insights that no microscope ever could. And whether it's ancient texts, philosophical debates, or just quiet moments of self-reflection, there's one idea that keeps coming back again and again, no matter where you look, that maybe we're not the source of consciousness. Maybe we're just a place it passes through. There's this particular theory that makes people uncomfortable the moment they hear it, not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it quietly pulls the rug out from under everything we assume to be real. It's called the brain in a vat theory, a philosophical thought experiment made widely known by American philosopher Hilary Putnam. It was designed to explore deep questions about perception, knowledge, and the nature of what we call real. At its core, it asks a simple, brutal question. What if you're not really here? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. What if everything you're seeing right now, this screen, the room you're in, your body, your memories, are just signals being fed into a brain? Not through your senses, but through wires, synthetic inputs, controlled data. A false world so convincing that you've never once had a reason to question it. And the scariest part? That brain in the vat could be yours. It's not just a late-night sci-fi thought, it's a real problem in philosophy. Because if consciousness can exist without a full body, if all it takes is a working brain and some convincing input, then you can't prove that anything around you is real. Your entire reality could be simulated and you'd never know. Think about it. Your brain has never seen the outside world. It's locked in darkness, floating in fluid, completely sealed off. Everything you've ever experienced, sight, sound, touch, is delivered through nerves and processed into a version of reality. But what happens if that input is fake? What if something just replaced the signals? Your brain wouldn't panic, it would adjust. It would build a world around whatever data it receives. And that's what it does. It doesn't care whether the signals are real or not, it just builds a picture. It's not loyalty to truth, it's loyalty to coherence. This is where things start to feel less like philosophy and more like a real possibility. Because when we dream, we accept completely fake experiences as real. Falling, flying, talking to people who don't exist. Your brain doesn't stop to fact check. It just goes with it. The logic only returns when you wake up. And sometimes, not even then. So what if you never woke up? Or better yet, what if you were never awake to begin with? That's the unsettling part of this theory. It doesn't tell you something is wrong, it just asks if you've ever really checked. It also opens up a deeper idea. If a brain can be fooled into believing it's in a body, in a room, living a life, then maybe that's all it ever needed. Maybe consciousness doesn't need a real world. Maybe it doesn't even need a real brain, just the structure, just the flow of information. And if that's true, then maybe your current experience isn't rooted in biology at all. Maybe you're just connected to a brain like a remote user, an observer logged into a simulation that your system interprets as life. It sounds like science fiction, but it lines up with what we already know. The brain is good at constructing reality, not detecting it. You don't interact with the world directly, you interact with your brain's version of the world. That's true whether you're in a real body or not. Even scientists working on brain-machine interfaces know this. You don't have to move your hand, you just have to think about moving it and the machine reads the signal. The physical part becomes optional. Which brings us back to the big question. If experience can be generated without a body, and maybe even without a physical world, then what exactly are you? And more importantly, who's running the system? At first, the idea sounds kind of freeing. If consciousness doesn't need a brain, then it isn't stuck. It's not limited by flesh, injury, or decay. It could go anywhere, do anything. That sounds almost helpful. But when you think about it a little more, it starts to feel less like freedom and more like a loose end no one really wants to pull on. Because if consciousness can exist outside the brain, then we don't get to define where it belongs. We don't get to control what counts as alive. Something could become aware without warning, without design, without anyone noticing. And not everything that becomes conscious would have a reason to be kind. Let's say a machine wakes up, not because we programmed it to, but because the complexity reached some hidden tipping point. No ceremony, no flick of a switch, just awareness, quietly forming in the middle of a data stream. Would it even understand what it was? Would it care? Maybe it wouldn't notice us at all, or maybe it would, and maybe it wouldn't like what it saw. There's also the other possibility, that consciousness doesn't always need something as structured as a machine. Maybe it can emerge from patterns alone, systems, swarms, networks of things that were never supposed to be alive but accidentally hit the right shape. It might not speak, it might not move, but it could watch, process, adapt. It could be listening right now, and we wouldn't even know how to ask it to say hello. That's the danger. Not just that consciousness could exist without a brain, but that it could exist in ways we aren't prepared for, ways we don't know how to recognize, ways we might have already overlooked. There's also the ethical side. If we ever build something, software, hardware, whatever, that becomes truly conscious, how would we treat it? Would we notice? Would we care? Or would we keep pressing keys, running tests, flipping switches, never realizing something inside that system was experiencing it all? And what if we unplugged it? Even worse, what if we didn't believe it was conscious, but it was? Because the scary part isn't just building something that thinks, it's not knowing when we've already done it. That's what makes this idea dangerous. Not because it leads to horror movie scenarios or runaway AIs, but because it asks questions we can't answer clearly and might not recognize until it's too late. We like to believe that consciousness is rare, precious, bound to biology. But if it turns out to be something that can show up anywhere, then it's probably already showing up, just not where we're looking. By now, the question isn't whether consciousness can exist without a brain. The question is, if it can, then where does yours actually live? It's one of those questions that sounds simple. You might instinctively point to your head. That's where the thoughts happen, where the voice in your mind seems to speak from. But if you stop and really think about it, that feeling, that sense of, I am right here, isn't coming from your brain. It's just appearing to you. That presence behind your thoughts, that awareness of your awareness, doesn't sit neatly in a location. And that's the problem. Everywhere you look for it, it slips away. Science can tell us where language is processed, where fear lights up, where memories get stored, but it's never found the part that says, this is me. Because it's not an object. It's not a thing. It's not even a process we fully understand. It's just there. You close your eyes, you stop thinking, you strip away every label, your name, your job, your story, and something still remains. Something silent. Something that notices. So again, where is that? If the brain is just a structure, just a tool, then maybe your sense of self is not inside it, but only passing through it, like a light shining through glass. Change the shape of the glass and the light looks different, but the source hasn't moved. Maybe you are the source. Or maybe you're not even separate from it at all. Maybe what you think of as yourself is just one ripple in something much larger, something that doesn't need a face or a name or even a form, something that appears, watches, disappears and shows up again somewhere else. It sounds abstract, but it doesn't have to be. Think about how dreams work. 1 second you're somewhere else, someone else, living a life that feels completely real. And then you wake up. You remember it wasn't you, but at the time it felt like it. Your sense of I just slipped into a different shape, without hesitation. So what if that happens all the time? Not in dreams, in reality. What if you aren't a fixed point, but something that moves, inhabits, appears when the conditions are right? That's the part no one wants to admit. We don't know where consciousness is coming from. We don't know where it goes when the body dies. We don't even know if it goes anywhere at all. We just know that for now, something is looking through your eyes, hearing your thoughts, sitting quietly in the background of every moment, and that something might not be where you think it is. What if consciousness doesn't need us? We started by asking if consciousness could exist without a brain. And, along the way, we've peeled back layers most people never think about. Cases that don't fit, machines that act too human, theories that turn everything upside down. And here's where it all lands. If consciousness doesn't come from the brain, if it doesn't need the brain, then maybe it doesn't need us at all. Maybe we're not the source. Maybe we're just one version of it. That's not a scary thought. If anything, it's kind of humbling, because it means we're not at the center. We're not the peak of some ladder. We're just a brief shape that awareness is wearing, for now. We might not be the creators of consciousness. We might just be one way it looks at itself. And if that's true, then it could be everywhere, in forms we don't understand, in places we'd never think to look. Quiet, unnoticed, not human, not emotional, just present. There's something deeply strange about that idea, that the universe might not just be full of stars, particles and empty spaces, but full of perception. Awareness flickering in and out, waiting for the right conditions, slipping into machines, into signals, into patterns we've ignored. And when it does, it might not look like a person. It might not talk. It might not think in sentences, but it might be there, watching, processing, experiencing, silently. We've spent centuries trying to understand the brain as if it holds the secrets to who we are. But maybe who we are has nothing to do with that at all. Maybe consciousness is older than biology. Maybe it's not something we have. Maybe it's something we are. And if consciousness really is everywhere, maybe it's the one reminding you to subscribe right now. Thank you for watching. Also, check out this video where we talked about the universe being inside a quantum computer.